If you look at the raw numbers
Mm.
of global finance right now, you run straight into this massive, almost dizzying paradox.
Oh, absolutely. The numbers are wild.
Right. So over the next decade, there is an absolute avalanche of wealth transferring directly to women. We're talking about a staggering $30 trillion. dollars.
30 trillion with a T.
30 trillion. Yet, uh, if you look at who actually holds the checkbooks in venture capital, like the people actually making the decisions about what our future looks like,
Hmm.
female-led funds are currently scraping by with less than 15% of the pie.
Yeah, which is just, it's a glaring disconnect.
Exactly. It completely forces you to ask how that disconnect is even possible. And more importantly, while the traditional finance world is kind of just dragging its feet, how are female investors quietly and meticulously engineering their own alternative systems to fix it?
It's arguably the biggest blind spot in modern capital right now. You have this massive pool of resources, but the established plumbing, the legacy networks that decide who gets funded and who just gets ignored, it's fundamentally broken for a huge demographic of founders.
Yeah.
The mechanics of how money moves from point A to point B, they simply weren't built with these founders in mind.
Right. Which brings us to our mission for today. Today, we're taking a deep dive into exactly how a completely new wave of female investors is evaluating founders.
Yeah.
And we're putting a laser focus on two critical metrics that the legacy gatekeepers almost always miss.
Narrative clarity and technical rapport.
Exactly. And our roadmap for this whole discussion comes from a really brilliant analysis by Lilian Raji.
Yeah, her perspective on this is so sharp.
It really is. And, what makes her perspective so unique is that she isn't looking at this from inside some traditional finance echo chamber. I want to read her bio just to give you the full context because it's impressive.
Go for it.
So she is a global luxury communications advisor, a fractional CMO, a columnist, and the president of the Lilian Raji agency, where for over 2 decades she's served as a trusted strategic advisor for some of the world's leading luxury brands.
Which gives her such a unique lens on value.
Completely. And she's also the founder of the PR Advisor, a platform inspired by her decade-long National Jeweler magazine column, offering communications and PR guidance and training for emerging to mid-sized brands.
Right, and we should mention her Forbes column, too.
Oh, yes. Her Forbes column, The Pursuit of Luxury, examines how luxury brands use emotional marketing to capture their very passionate customers. So her analysis is essential here because she looks at capital through the lens of, communication and human behavior.
Exactly. And before we can even get into how these new investors evaluate founders, we really have to understand the systemic failure that forced them to build entirely new pipelines from scratch. I mean, it basically comes down to a fundamental proximity issue.
Okay, let's unpack this proximity issue. Because Lillian's analysis highlights this concept of the let me check with my wife investor.
Oh, yeah. That happens all the time.
Walk me through the actual mechanics of that. Like, what is actually happening in those boardrooms?
So it happens constantly, especially in the consumer brand space. You have male investors sitting on investment committees, right?
Yeah.
And they are being pitched a product that they themselves will never, ever use.
Right.
So because they aren't the target customer, they literally lack the lived experience to evaluate if the product is actually good or, if it solves a real problem or if the branding even resonates. They hit a wall in their due diligence.
They just can't see it.
Exactly. To get around it, they basically outsource their judgment to a household proxy. They go home, describe the product to their wives or daughters, and ask, hey, does this make sense?
It's like asking a lifelong vegetarian to review a high-end steakhouse.
Ah, yes, that's a perfect analogy.
Right. Like, they can look at the profit and loss statement. They can analyze the foot traffic.
The margins on the drinks.
Yeah. But they cannot actually taste the steak. So they have to call their spouse to ask, hey, is this steak actually any good? But the spouse isn't in the restaurant. They haven't seen the menu, didn't hear the chef's vision.
Yeah.
And now they're forced to judge the entire business model based on like a 10-second text message summary.
Which is just a terrible way to price risk. That is the proxy problem in a nutshell. And the larger implication is devastating for founders.
Oh, so?
Well, the person they are asking at home is never as informed as the investor who actually sat through the pitch, read the deck, and interrogated the financials. The proxy is making a snap judgment completely devoid of context.
I see.
And when that snap judgment comes back as a no or even just a maybe, the investor passes on the deal.
Wow. And because these investors lack that proximity to the end user, they have to rely on something else to make their decisions, right?
Right.
They fall back on pattern matching.
Exactly. When you don't intuitively understand the product or the customer base, you just default to what has already scaled in the past. In the venture world, pattern matching almost always means looking for the next software as a service giant. It's safe, it's familiar, and it's tech-heavy. But by doing that, they completely miss massive, highly lucrative consumer plays.
You see this with brands like Poppy, the prebiotic soda, or Seat
Oh,
Foods.
massive successes.
Huge. These are massive, mainstream consumer successes that traditional tech-focused VCs often just scroll right past because they don't fit the established pattern of a Silicon Valley unicorn.
And this structural failure, this reliance on uninformed proxies and lazy pattern matching is exactly what has forced women to create their own financial infrastructure. I mean, they've stopped waiting for institutions to adapt.
They're building their own tables.
Exactly. Instead, you see the rise of highly curated networks. For instance, the Dealmakers Hamptons gathering, where senior women investors and retail executives just bypass the traditional gatekeepers entirely to forge lucrative partnerships directly.
Or platforms like Cherub, right?
Yes, Cherub is a great
Now,
example.
Margaret Hines, one of the investors' Lilian profiles, describes Cherub as the Raya for deal flow. It's this exclusive network specifically designed to connect funders with female founders, completely sidestepping that entire "let me ask my wife" bottleneck.
It replaces the uninformed proxy with direct access. Which brings us to how this new pipeline actually functions. Because traditional pattern matching fails so spectacularly for these founders, this new infrastructure requires a completely different kind of stress test.
And the very first major hurdle they look for is brand narrative.
Right. Let's look at the approach of Larina Chenmeta of LWC Ventures. With a 2-decade background in consumer PR, she effectively acts as the rigorous due diligence that her male counterparts are usually outsourcing.
So she's bringing that comms expertise right to the cap table.
Exactly. For Chenmeta, brand clarity is a precondition of investment. It's not a deliverable that you just figure out later.
Right.
A product sitting on a shelf cannot magically sell itself, no matter how objectively good it is. It needs an unshakable narrative to educate the consumer, to tell them exactly why they need it in their lives.
The author shares this specific, honestly painful anecdote about an uncoachable wine company founder.
Oh, that story's rough.
Yeah, so Chenmeta tried to offer structural recommendations, feedback on brand voice, launch planning, and the founder just refused to take any of it. They insisted
Yeah.
their way was the only way.
And the venture failed. Every single time that founder tried to scale with a broken narrative, it failed. And because of that experience, Chenmeta now immediately disqualifies any founder who isn't open to feedback or who expects to figure out their brand narrative during the raise.
Okay, wait, I need to stop you there and push back on this a little.
Okay, go for it.
Because in traditional tech VC, isn't that exactly what seed money is designed for? You raise those early rounds to give yourself the runway, to find product market fit, to figure out exactly who you are and what the market wants. Why is discovering your narrative considered a red flag here?
What's fascinating here is that in the consumer space, the narrative is the product market fit.
Oh, interesting.
If you are reworking your core story while you are actively asking for money, you are essentially asking investors to fund your identity crisis.
Ouch. Yeah.
You don't secure capital to discover your narrative. You secure capital to execute a narrative that is already crystal clear. As Lilian points out, the runway isn't for soul searching, it's for distribution.
Ah, okay. So
Yeah.
the money is the fuel, but you have to already have the engine fully built.
Precisely.
If a founder expects the investor to help them figure out who they serve or what problem they solve, they have completely misunderstood the sequence of operations.
And when a founder does have that clarity, the impact is explosive. Chenmeta operates a syndicate structure, which is really key here.
Yeah, explain how that syndicate dynamic actually works under the hood. Like, why does one small check matter so much?
Well, venture capital is highly susceptible to herd mentality. A syndicate is basically a group of investors pooling their money, usually led by one person who does the heavy lifting on the due diligence.
Okay.
So a single, well-placed $10,000 check from a narrative-fluent lead like Chenmeta can suddenly pull a $250,000 round right behind it.
Wow. Just from that one signal.
Exactly. Her confidence in the narrative acts as the ultimate signal to other investors who might not have her PR expertise, but they trust her judgment.
So narrative fluency is clearly the key for consumer brands. But if you shift over to the deep tech sector, there is an entirely different But equally vital, language required, right? Scientific fluency.
This is where we meet Dr. Nia Lee, a partner at Alpha Intelligence Capital. Her background is just incredible.
It really is. She's a Vietnamese refugee whose family arrived with nothing. She became a Gates Scholar, earned a PhD in bioengineering, and is a veteran of WARF, which is the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, the world's oldest university-based tech transfer office.
And to understand her methodology, we really have to understand what a tech transfer office actually does. It doesn't just take science out of an academic lab. It attempts to bridge the valley of death between a government research grant and a commercially viable product.
Right.
Dr. Lee's fundamental insight is that high-level science is essentially taxpayer-funded research. But it often just sits in academic journals collecting dust. Private venture capital is the high-risk mechanism necessary to get that science out of the lab and into our lives.
The example that really illustrates this was that Singapore company that figured out how to make commercial yarn out of algae and seaweed.
Yes, such a cool example.
Because of private capital stepping in to fund the scaling process, that complex deep tech science literally ended up as a garment walking down a Stella McCartney catwalk at Milan Fashion Week.
And the mechanism that makes that possible is what we can call the technical rapport advantage. In deep tech, how do you actually stress test a scientist?
Right. You can't just nod along to a slick pitch deck.
Exactly. You have to ask about the edge cases of the physics, the failure rates in the lab, the scalability of the chemical compounds. If an investor cannot speak the actual science with the founders, they simply cannot do the due diligence.
And because they can't do the diligence, they cannot build rapport.
Right. Which means they get locked out of the most competitive investment rounds.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the power dynamic completely flips here. We are so used to the trope of, the desperate founder begging the rich VC for a check.
Oh, yeah. The Shark Tank dynamic.
Exactly. But in deep tech, if a founder has built something scientifically irreplaceable, the investors are often the ones begging for allocation in the round. It proves that dumb money like capital that brings a checkbook but no specialized knowledge to the table is becoming completely obsolete.
It is entirely obsolete in that space. If you've built a proprietary technology, you set your own terms. And Dr. Lee connects this technical fluency directly to a founder's capacity for accountability.
How so?
She shared this story about a portfolio company that was doing under $1 million in revenue, but they scaled so rapidly, they hit a $300 to $500 million valuation in a fraction of the time expected.
Wow.
The sheer pressure of that hypergrowth just completely broke their internal human architecture.
They outgrew their own systems, the communication broke down, the operations just couldn't keep up.
But instead of hiding it, the founders owned it. They didn't try to spin it in a board meeting. They went to their investors and said, here is exactly where our systems failed. Here is the technical reason why we couldn't scale the operations fast enough. And here's the exact architecture we are building to fix it.
And for Dr. Lee, that honest accountability was the actual signal. A founder who can clearly articulate the mechanics of where their system broke is a founder who has the technical and mental capacity to rebuild it.
Exactly. Hiding the failure would have been the red flag. Dissecting the failure was the green light.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most crucial phase of how these female investors evaluate talent. Because narrative gets you in the room, right? And technical rapport proves the product works. But what actually gets the wire transfer sent?
It's what happens when the founder doesn't even realize they are pitching.
Right. This is the evaluation of character, drive, and coachability.
Let's look at Catherine Drummond Lake of CDL Ventures. She openly admits she doesn't really have a rigid, sector-specific thesis. She invests in character over spreadsheets.
And her investment in Maggie Rose McCarr, the founder of Zant, shows exactly how this works in practice.
Yeah, Zant is a mental health platform. McCarr had delivered an elevator pitch at an event in Los Angeles that was just perfect on paper. The market size, the unit economics, the problem-solution fit, it was all there.
But that isn't what sealed the deal for Lake.
No, not at all. The deal was sealed on a freezing, windy day in a New York City playground.
I love this story.
McCarr traveled all the way out there just to hang out with Lake and Lake's young daughter. No pitch deck, no formal presentation, just spending human time together.
You might wonder why a playground visit matters more than a financial model. It matters because a pitch deck is a controlled environment.
It is armor.
Yes. It is a rehearsed performance where you control all the variables. But when you are freezing on a playground, you can't fall back on a slide about your total addressable market. You just have to be a person trying to solve a problem.
It strips away the armor and forces the investor to look at your intrinsic motivation.
So what does this all mean? The fact that a founder would take the time to show up in the cold, with nothing immediately at stake, signaled a level of grit and genuine human connection that no financial projection could ever capture. It tells the investor who this person will be when the market turns and things get incredibly difficult.
We see a different but equally intense evaluation of character with Margaret Hines, the investor behind Navi.
Yes, no.
Navi is a clinician-led, completely AI-free mental health app for teens. Hines built it after seeing a massive infrastructure gap following her husband Kevin's suicide prevention work.
Right, he would speak to hundreds of thousands of kids, but when he left the stage, there was no immediate, accessible follow-up support for them.
Exactly. And because Hines refused to use AI because she stated unequivocally that she would rather not make billions of dollars than have a single child's death on her conscience due to a cheaper automated system hallucinating or giving bad advice, 6 different venture capitalists rejected her when she was pre-revenue.
6 of them.
6. They looked at her margins without AI, decided it wasn't profitable enough, and told her to come back when she hit $1 million in revenue.
But she didn't fold. She invested her own money, secured massive government contracts that validated her clinician-led model, and became revenue positive in her very first year.
And of course, once she de-risked the investment and proved the model worked without AI, those same 6 VCs came crawling back asking for equity.
And Hines rejected every single one of them.
Yep.
She told them no, because they weren't there when it actually counted. They wanted the upside without taking the early risk. They didn't believe in the mission when it was hard. They only believed in the math once it was safe.
Which goes back to her days working on the earliest funding rounds for Tesla at Vantage Point Capital. Hines observed Elon Musk before anyone really knew his name, and she noted that his early success was entirely rooted in self-awareness.
Really? Self-awareness.
Yeah. He knew exactly what he didn't know about manufacturing at scale, and he strategically attached himself to the pioneers who had the answers.
That is the ultimate test of a founder's character for these investors. Do you have the self-awareness to know your blind spots? Do you have the coachability to take feedback when someone points out a flaw in your narrative? And how do you treat people when they have nothing immediate to offer you?
Exactly. The pitch starts long, long before the formal ask. How you respond to pushback, how you treat the assistant in the lobby, how you show up when there is no money on the table. That is the real due diligence.
And Lily makes a crucial point here that every founder needs to internalize. Due diligence runs both ways.
It has to.
Founders must evaluate their potential investors with the exact same rigor that investors are applying to them. If an investor can only offer a check, but lacks the technical fluency to understand your product or the network to secure a government contract, they are essentially just a proxy.
And they should be at the bottom of your list.
This has been such an eye-opening journey. When we started, we looked at that $30 trillion wealth transfer. It's clear now that it isn't just a shift in who holds the bank accounts. It is a fundamental shift in methodology.
Oh, without a doubt.
We are watching the real-time replacement of outdated proxies with rigorous value-driven diligence. Whether it's Lorena Chen Mehta rigorously evaluating the mechanics of your brand narrative, Dr. Neelay stress-testing the edges of your scientific fluency, or Catherine Drummond Lake watching how you act when your armor is stripped away on a freezing playground, this new wave of investors is demanding more.
They are actively building the pipelines that the legacy systems failed to provide. They aren't just allocating capital, they are engineering an ecosystem of ambition that actually understands the people it's funding.
Exactly. Now, to dive deeper into all this, you really need to read Lilian's full article on Forbes. And you can find more of her brilliant analysis on the luxury industry by visiting her website at www.lilianraji.com. Also, be sure to connect with her on LinkedIn and follow her on Instagram and YouTube.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over, building on everything we've discussed today. If this new wave of investors is actively engineering pipelines that demand genuine technical rapport, unshakable narrative clarity, and deep character evaluation, what legacy systems in your own industry are fundamentally mispricing value right now simply because they're still relying on outdated proxies?